A man who spent a year eating nothing but bark and desperation walked into a stranger's barn to steal hay. He wasn't planning to stay. He wasn't planning to feel anything. He was just trying to survive one more night in a winter that had already killed everything soft inside him. But the woman who found him didn't scream. She didn't reach for a weapon. She asked him if he was hungry. And that one question, 4 simple words from a widow standing alone in the snow, unraveled a decade of walls he'd built around himself. This is the story of what happened next. If this story reaches you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Like, subscribe, and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The storm had been building for 3 days before it finally made up its mind. By the time it hit the high country, it wasn't snowing anymore. It was assaulting. The kind of weather that didn't care about your plans or your prayers or the carefully maintained idea you had of yourself as a man who could handle anything. The wind came in sideways off the northern ridge and drove ice crystals so fine they found their way through every gap in a coat, every loose thread in a scarf, every tiny crack between a man's collar and the back of his neck. Rhett Calloway had been moving through it for 2 days. He wasn't moving fast. Fast wasn't possible anymore. His left leg had started dragging somewhere around midday yesterday. He didn't know why exactly, didn't have the energy to investigate, and his right hand had lost real feeling in the fingers sometime before dawn. He kept flexing them inside his mitten just to remind himself they were still attached. The motion was automatic by now. Flex, release, a rhythm as meaningless as a clock in an empty house. He was 34 years old and he felt like something that had been left outside too long. The pack on his back weighed maybe 12 pounds, which was nothing for a man his size under normal circumstances. Rhett stood 6'3" in his boots and had the kind of build that came not from intention, but from years of hauling, climbing, and surviving in terrain that didn't welcome visitors. Wide through the shoulders, thick in the forearms. A jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite he'd been sleeping on for the past 11 months. 12 pounds should have been nothing. But he hadn't eaten anything of real substance in 4 days. Before that, a rabbit he'd managed to trap. Stringy and small, barely worth the effort of building the fire to cook it. Before that, 3 days of nothing. Before that, a palmful of dried berries he'd found frozen under a spruce tree, which he'd eaten so fast he couldn't even remember the taste. The body, when it gets hungry enough, starts making trades. First it burns the fat, what little there is. Then the muscle. Then it starts borrowing from places it can't afford to borrow from, and you stop being a man capable of complex thought and become something simpler, something that moves toward warmth, something that moves toward food. Rhett had stopped being complex somewhere around the second week of January. Now it was February, and he was an animal with boots on, and he was putting one foot in front of the other in a whiteout blizzard. Not because he had a destination in mind, but because stopping meant dying, and some stubborn, irrational part of him had not yet agreed to die. He almost missed the fence post. It was half buried, leaning hard to the left, the top of it barely visible above a drift that had built itself up against the tree line like it had somewhere to be. But he saw it. And he stopped walking for the first time in hours and just stared at it, because a fence post meant someone had put it there, and someone putting it there meant a person, and a person meant don't get ahead of yourself. He'd learned that lesson. Twice before in the past year, he'd spotted signs of habitation that turned out to be abandoned. A trapper's shack collapsed under 3 seasons of snow, a lean-to that some optimist had built against a cliff face and that the cliff face had eventually rejected. He'd spent a whole afternoon following what he thought was a road before he realized it was a dry creek bed that wound around a mountain for 4 miles before ending at a rock wall. So he didn't let himself hope. He just followed the fence line. It took another 40 minutes of walking before the shape of the barn emerged from the white. Not a collapsed barn, not a ruin, but a standing barn with a snow-loaded roof that was still holding its own geometry against the weight. There was a split-rail corral attached to the side, half buried in drifts, and beyond it, set back from the barn by maybe 60 feet, a cabin. Small. 1 chimney. The chimney was putting out smoke. Rhett stopped again. He stood there in the driving snow and watched that smoke for a full minute. It was gray-white against the white sky and barely visible, but it was real. It was moving. It was evidence that somewhere in that small, snow-buried cabin, someone had built a fire, and that fire was happening right now. He didn't go to the cabin. He went to the barn, That was the calculation of a man in the particular condition Rhett was in. A man living inside a structure is unpredictable. They might be welcoming. They might have a gun aimed at the door before he even knocked. Rhett didn't have the reserves left for the uncertainty of a human being. The barn was safer. The barn was hay and shelter and the possible warmth of animals, and that was all he needed. He would disappear before morning. Take nothing that would be badly missed. The barn door had a latch, iron, simple, and frozen half shut. He worked it for 2 minutes with fingers that barely functioned before it gave, and then he was inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and the wind was gone. The relief was almost hallucinatory. It wasn't warm inside the barn, not warm the way the cabin would be warm, but it was still, and the absence of wind was so profound that Rhett stood just inside the door and breathed for a moment like a man who'd been held underwater. The air smelled of hay and manure and horse and something faintly sweet that he couldn't identify. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light that filtered through gaps in the board siding. There were 2 horses in the stalls, a big gray draft animal that regarded him with the profound disinterest of horses everywhere, and a smaller chestnut mare who turned her head and watched him with mild suspicion but didn't spook. Beside them, a pen with 3 goats that immediately started making noise the second they saw him, their yellow eyes wide with the particular alarm of creatures who operate on the assumption that most things are a threat. "Hush," Rhett said. His voice came out wrong, rough, barely functional, like a tool that hadn't been used in too long. He was startled by the sound of it in the closed space. The goats hushed, which surprised him. He found the hay piled against the back wall, and he sat down in it and just stopped. Stopped moving, stopped planning, stopped the constant low-level machinery of his survival brain. He pulled his knees up and let the hay close around him, and after a while his shivering began to slow, and his eyes closed. He didn't mean to sleep. He woke to the sound of the barn door opening. The light had changed, grayer, the dim gray of early morning. And for a disoriented moment, he couldn't remember where he was, or what the smell was, or why his whole body hurt so comprehensively. Then it came back in pieces. The storm, the fence post, the barn. And now there was someone standing in the doorway. She was backlit by the gray morning outside, so he couldn't see her face clearly at first. What he registered was practical. Medium height, wearing a heavy wool coat that was too large for her, carrying a wooden bucket in one hand, and not moving. She had seen him. He hadn't moved fast enough to hide. The barn was maybe 40 feet deep. He was in the back of it. She was at the door. Between them were 2 horses, 3 goats, and about 30 feet of silence. Rhett considered his options in approximately half a second. Running wasn't going to work. His leg still wasn't right, and she had the door. Talking required a voice, which he demonstrated was barely operational. He was sitting in her hay, in her barn, uninvited, and he was fairly certain, like something the mountain had chewed up and spat out. She set the bucket down. She still hadn't screamed. "Have you eaten?" she said. Her voice was even. Not frightened. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Practical. The voice of someone asking a question they actually wanted answered. Rhett opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "No," he said. The word hung in the cold barn air between them. She looked at him for another long moment. Really looked. The way a person looks at something they're assessing rather than merely seeing. Then she picked the bucket back up, turned, and said, "Come inside when you're ready. Door's unlocked." And she walked out. He sat in the hay for another 5 minutes, trying to determine whether this was real. It had the texture of a fever dream, the kind his brain had started producing last week when the cold got bad enough. In fever dreams, things were too easy. Things went too well. But the goats were real. The cold was real. The ache in his leg was real. He got up. The cabin was smaller inside than it looked from outside, which was an architectural achievement of the frontier that never ceased to impress Rhett. One main room served as kitchen, living space, and dining room simultaneously. A loft above with a rope ladder. A single window on the south wall, the glass thick and slightly wavy, letting in the battered light of the storm. A wood stove in the corner with a cast iron pot on top of it that was producing steam, and a smell that hit Rhett so hard he actually stopped walking. He couldn't identify what was in the pot. Didn't matter. The woman was at the stove with her back to him when he came in. She'd shed the large wool coat and was wearing a plain work dress in dark blue, a heavy cotton apron over it, her hair pinned up with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to put her hair up before work rather than after. She heard him come in but didn't turn around immediately. "Close the door all the way," she said. "It sticks." He closed it. The warmth of the room hit him in stages. First his face, which he hadn't realized was numb until it started not being numb, which felt like being stung by small insects all across his cheekbones and the bridge of his nose. Then his chest. Then, gradually, his hands, which he held toward the wood stove without even thinking about it. "Sit down," she said. "Bowls on the table." He sat at the small table, 2 chairs, one clearly used more than the other, a lamp in the center that wasn't lit because the wood stove was putting out enough light to see by. There was indeed a wooden bowl on the table, and a spoon next to it, and the placement of these items struck him as strange in a way he couldn't immediately account for. Then he realized why. She'd set it out before she went to the barn. She'd known he was there. He looked up at her. She was ladling something from the pot into the bowl, a thick stew, beans, and something that looked like it might once have been salt pork, steam rising in a column. She set it in front of him without ceremony and sat down in the other chair with her own bowl and started eating. Rhett ate. He made himself eat slowly because he knew from hard experience what happened if you didn't, and the self-control required to maintain the pace was the hardest thing he'd done in days. The stew was simple: salt, beans, fat, a few limp root vegetables he couldn't identify. It tasted like it had been waiting on the stove all morning. It tasted like the best thing he'd ever put in his mouth, and he knew that was circumstance rather than cuisine, but it didn't matter. They didn't talk while they ate. When his bowl was empty, she refilled it without asking, and he ate that too. After the second bowl, he sat back and just breathed and tried to remember the last time he'd had 2 helpings of anything. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No? Where from originally?" He thought about that. "Kentucky? Fayette County? Long time ago." "How long you been in the mountains?" "About 11 months this stretch." He paused. "Before that, on and off since I was 20. She nodded like this meant something specific to her. "Trapper?" "Was." "What happened to your traps?" "Lost them," he said. "November. Broke through ice crossing a creek. Lost my pack, most of my gear." "And you've been surviving on what since November?" He looked at his hands on the table. Big hands, knuckles split and healed and split again. The skin around his wrists an unhealthy color he'd been trying not to think about too hard. "Whatever I could find." "That would explain the look of you. It wasn't cruel, it was just accurate." He found he didn't mind it. A person who tells you the truth without decoration is a rare thing on the frontier. "I wasn't going to take anything of consequence," he said. "From the barn, just the hay to sleep on." "I know." "How?" She looked at him directly for the first time. Really looked. Not the assessing look from the barn door, but something more even, more measuring. Her eyes were gray-green in the cabin light, the color of the river in early spring, and there were lines at the corners of them that came from squinting against sun and wind rather than from age. He put her somewhere in her early 30s. She had a straight-edged, unsentimental face with a small scar above her left eyebrow that she'd clearly had long enough not to notice anymore. "Because if you'd wanted to steal something worth stealing," she said, "you'd have gone for the horses." He stared at her. A very small thing happened at one corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the general neighborhood. "Mara Whitlock," she said. He cleared his throat. "Rhett Calloway." "Well, Rhett Calloway." She stood and took both their bowls to the basin. "The storm's going to run at least another day. You can sleep in front of the stove." She paused with her back to him. "Not in the barn. It's too cold, and I'm not spending firewood on a guest who won't be warm enough to do anything useful in the morning." He blinked. "I wasn't planning on staying past tonight." "I know that too." She turned around and looked at him with the same level steadiness. "But the latch on the barn door is broken, and if I don't get it fixed, the horses are going to get out the next time the wind kicks up, and you've got the size for it." He opened his mouth, closed it again. "Sleep," she said, and that settled the matter. He woke on the floor in front of the wood stove with a horse blanket over him and no memory of lying down. Morning light, real morning, not the false gray of the storm, was coming through the south-facing window. The stove had burned down to coals. Somewhere outside, he could hear the specific silence that means snow has stopped. He lay there and stared at the ceiling, rough-hewn boards close together, the gaps chinked with what looked like a mixture of mud and horsehair, and tried to take stock of himself. His leg felt better. The weird dragging sensation was gone, replaced with a deep bone ache that was at least familiar and navigable. His hands had full feeling back, which was a relief large enough that he spent a moment just opening and closing his fists and marveling at the sensation. He was hungry again already, but it was an ordinary hunger rather than the hollow, dangerous kind. The kind that said, "Find food rather than you are running out of time." He sat up. Mara was already at the stove, her back to him, working at something in the cast iron skillet. The smell was eggs. She must have chickens somewhere, though he hadn't noticed a coop last night. "You're up?" she said without turning around. "Yeah." "There's coffee." He found the tin cup on the edge of the stove and poured from the battered coffee pot and sat back down at the table. The coffee was strong enough to be almost aggressive, and he appreciated that. She set a plate in front of him, 2 eggs, a thick slice of bread that had been toasted on the stove's surface, and a small piece of something cured and salted that he thought might be venison. She sat across from him with her own plate. They ate. This time, partway through, she talked. "The barn latch is the most urgent thing," she said. It was clear she'd been thinking through a list and was now reading from it. "After that, there's a section of the north fence that's been pushed over by snow load. Won't matter until the melt, but when the melt comes, everything that's not fixed will go wrong at once, so better to get ahead of it now." He looked at her over his coffee. "You're telling me the maintenance situation. I'm telling you what needs doing." She met his look. "What you do with the information is your business." He set the cup down, looked at the table, looked at his hands, looked at the battered skillet she'd cooked breakfast in, which had been repaired at some point. The handle had broken and been replaced with a piece of iron rod that didn't quite match, the weld visible but solid. Everything in this cabin had been repaired with whatever was available. Everything here had been broken and fixed by one person working alone. "I'll look at the latch," he said. She nodded and went back to her plate. But the latch was worse than it looked from outside. The iron had sheared clean through at the pivot point. Not a failure from the cold, but from stress and age. The metal simply tired of doing its job. The kind of repair that required new iron stock, a forge, and someone who knew what they were doing with both. Rhett found, in the barn's small storage corner, a collection of mismatched hardware that spoke to years of frontier improvisation. He sorted through it with half-frozen fingers, crouching in the rectangle of gray light from the open barn door, and eventually found a bracket that was the wrong size but the right material, and a short length of iron rod that could be bent to serve. He spent 2 hours on it. Mara came out at mid-morning with a mug of coffee and set it on the fence rail without comment and went back inside. He drank it standing, staring at the half-assembled latch mechanism, the metal biting cold through his gloves. The repair he eventually came up with wasn't elegant. The bracket was slightly too wide and he'd had to hammer it to shape using a stone as a makeshift anvil, and the rod wasn't quite the right gauge, and the whole thing had a distinctly improvised aesthetic. But when he pushed the latch into place and lifted and dropped the barn door 3 times, testing, it held. He stepped back. Something moved in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. More like the quiet satisfaction of a problem ceasing to be a problem. He went and looked at the north fence. The fence section had been pushed over by a snowdrift that had built against it from the north side. 3 sections of rail down, the posts still in the ground but leaning, the ground too frozen to do proper post work. It would need to wait for thaw to fix properly. But he could brace the posts, reset the rails, pack snow against the bases to hold them until the ground softened. He spent the afternoon doing that. Mara brought out a second mug of coffee at some point and a heel of bread and set them on the nearest standing fence post, and Rhett ate and drank without really stopping work, balancing the bread on the fence while he sighted down the line of rails. The sun was getting low by the time he came inside. She had cornbread and a bean soup waiting, and a basin of water she'd heated on the stove so he could wash his hands, and she pointed at both of these things in sequence without speaking. He washed his hands and sat at the table, and she poured the soup and they ate. "Latch is fixed," he said. "I noticed. North fence is braced. Posts need proper resetting in spring." "I know." He looked at her. "You've been managing all of this alone." It wasn't quite a question. She answered it like it was one. My husband died in October, she said. Infection in his leg. Started as nothing, and then it wasn't nothing. She said it flatly, the way a person says a thing they've said enough times that the emotional content has been somewhat worn off of it, but not entirely worn off. He could see it in the set of her jaw. His name was Daniel. I'm sorry, Rhett said. So am I. She looked at the table. He was good at the things you did today, the practical things. She paused. I'm good at other things. What things? She looked up, and there was something briefly and unexpectedly wry in her expression. Farming, livestock, keeping track of what needs doing, making do with what's available. She held his gaze. Making do is something I'm very good at. He believed her entirely. That night she pointed him to the loft. Warmer than the floor, she said, and the storm had cleared, which meant the temperature outside was dropping fast. He climbed the rope ladder and lay in the narrow loft space under a pile of quilts and listened to the cabin settle around him. The wood contracting in the cold. The particular silence of snow-covered wilderness at night, so thick it was almost a physical presence. He thought about Kentucky. He thought about the mountains. He thought about the year just past, the long, solitary months of it, the way that much time alone does something to a person's sense of what's real. You start measuring things differently. Not weeks and months, but the weight of your pack, the depth of the snow, the number of days since you last saw a human face. He thought about the question she'd asked him. Have you eaten? 4 words. Not who are you or what do you want or get off my property. Just the most direct possible acknowledgement of the obvious fact of his situation. He didn't know what to do with a person like that. He fell asleep trying to figure it out. He was gone before she woke up, or he meant to be. He'd been up since before dawn, in the gray pre-light, sitting on the edge of the loft with his boots in his hands, trying to remember how to be the kind of man who didn't complicate other people's lives. His pack was beside him, re-provisioned very slightly. She'd left dried beans and a small wrapped piece of salt pork on the table, which he was fairly sure wasn't accidental, and he'd packed them without letting himself think too hard about the gesture. He climbed down the ladder. His boots were on, his pack was on. He was standing at the door, and then he turned around and looked at the cabin one more time, just to fix it in memory the way a person does with things they know they're leaving behind, and he saw the wood box. It was almost empty. He'd used it himself, banking the stove before going up to the loft. He hadn't thought about what it meant that he'd been the one doing that instead of her. Hadn't thought about what it meant that the box had been almost full yesterday and was now almost empty. She'd need to refill it today. He'd seen the wood pile, the split wood stacked along the east side of the cabin under a tarpaulin. It was enough to last, but the splitting was ahead in the work. There were whole rounds still to be split, the axe standing in the block beside them. And she'd spent all of yesterday keeping the fire going, cooking, managing the barn chores. He set his pack down, just for the wood box. That was the deal he made with himself. He'd fill the wood box, and then he'd go. He went outside in the early morning cold, and he split wood for an hour. The cold was sharp and clean, the air perfectly still after the storm, and the sound of the axe was very loud in the silence. He worked until he was warm enough to shed his outer coat, and then he kept working, splitting and stacking the split pieces against the cabin wall. He heard the cabin door open. Mara stood in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. She looked at the stack of wood he'd built. Then she looked at him. She handed him a mug. He took it. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. A bird called somewhere in the tree line. The first bird song he'd heard in months, some small winter bird that had decided the storm was over. It called twice, then went quiet. The chickens need tending, Mara said finally. Coop's behind the barn. They haven't been out since the storm started. He looked at her. I'll get to the coop after coffee, he said. Something moved across her face. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a fact. She nodded once and went back inside. He stood in the cold morning with his coffee and looked at the tree line and the wide white expanse of her fields and the distant gray shapes of the mountains he'd been living in for nearly a year. He drank his coffee. He went and tended the chickens. That was how it started. No agreement was reached, no terms were set. No one said anything like, you can stay or I'll stay, because that would have required both of them to acknowledge what was happening and neither was built for that kind of direct reckoning with their own needs. What happened instead was more like weather, gradual, inexorable, and difficult to argue with. He fixed the latch. Then he filled the wood box. Then he tended the chickens. Then he noticed the hinge on the coop door was pulling away from the rotted wood of the frame, so he replaced the frame section with a piece of sound lumber from the scrap pile. Then he noticed that the water trough in the barn was leaking from a seam on the south end, so he spent a morning recalking it with pine tar he found in the barn stores. Then he noticed something else. Then another thing. Days became a week. He slept in the loft. She cooked. He worked outside, and she managed the house, and the livestock feeding, and the 100 internal tasks of keeping a frontier household operational. They ate together twice a day and talked about what needed doing, and occasionally, briefly, about other things. She was from Missouri originally, the western edge, near the Kansas line. She'd come out with Daniel 6 years ago, which meant she'd been on this homestead long enough to have a working knowledge of its particular problems and an established relationship with its particular character. She talked about it like a person talks about a difficult but respected colleague. This land had demands. She understood them and met them because that was the arrangement. Rhett understood that entirely. One evening, maybe 10 days in, they were sitting at the table after supper. She was mending something, a tear in the large wool coat she wore outside, and he was repairing a piece of harness leather that had cracked from the cold, and she said, without looking up from her sewing, "You don't have to stay, you know." He looked up. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I know that too." She made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement and went back to her sewing. He looked at the harness in his hands. The crack in the leather was clean, a cold weather break, not rot. It could be repaired properly with the right approach. He'd found an awl in the barn stores and a length of waxed thread, and he was working the thread through the prepared holes with careful, deliberate stitches. "My wife left," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things do when you've been alone long enough that the silence stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like a kind of suffocation. Mara's sewing slowed but didn't stop. "How long ago?" 8 years. "Because of the mountains?" "Because of everything the mountains meant." He paused. "I was gone more than I was home. That's not a life for a woman to wait around for." "Did she say that?" She didn't have to. Mara set her sewing in her lap. She looked at him with the same level, straight look she'd been giving him since the barn. "What did she say?" He thought about it. "I don't know who you are when you're here." He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't wrong. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her sewing again. "Daniel used to say that the land doesn't care about your reasons," she said. "It just cares whether the work gets done." She pushed the needle through the wool. "I used to think that was a sad thing to believe. Now I think it might be the most honest thing I ever heard." Rhett looked at the harness. He looked at his hands. He set the harness down and picked it back up and kept stitching, and the lamp burned on the table between them. And outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. But it was a different kind of silence than it had been before. 3 weeks in, it snowed again. Not the catastrophic blizzard of before, but a steady, heavy, days-long snowfall that dumped another 2 feet on top of what was already there and kept them both close to the property. Rhett spent most of those days working in the barn. There was always work in the barn, he was discovering, the kind of accumulated maintenance that happens when a person is managing alone and triaging constantly, fixing only the most immediately critical things and leaving the rest for later. He replaced 3 broken stall boards. He rehung the hay door that had been sagging on a twisted hinge. He sorted and organized the tool corner, which had the beautiful chaos of a place where things had been put down in a hurry and never properly returned. He found a photograph while he was clearing the corner. It had fallen behind a loose board in the wall. Small, the old kind, slightly faded, the image soft with age. A man and a woman on what looked like a porch somewhere, the woman recognizably younger Mara, and the man beside her tall and lean with a narrow, earnest face that looked like it smiled easily. Rhett held it for a moment. Then he propped it carefully on the edge of the stall and went back to work. And the next morning the photograph was gone. And he never mentioned finding it. And she never mentioned it disappearing. And that was fine. Some things didn't need to be talked about. What did get talked about, gradually, in the evenings, at the table, was more than either of them had intended to share. She told him about Missouri, about the farm her parents had kept, the particular quality of the flat light there in late summer, the way the wheat fields moved in the wind. She told him about meeting Daniel at a church social when she was 19, and how he'd been so nervous he'd knocked over a glass of cider on the tablecloth and spent 20 minutes apologizing. She laughed when she told that part, not the warm memory laugh of the recently bereaved, but a genuine, slightly surprised laugh, like she'd forgotten she was allowed to find things funny. He told her about Kentucky, about his father, who'd been a farrier and expected Rhett to be a farrier, and how that had been the first thing Rhett had walked away from. About the first winter he'd spent in the mountains, 20 years old, convinced he was going to die approximately 3 times before January. And how he hadn't died, and what that had done to his understanding of his own limits. Made me too confident, he said. How so? Made me think if I survived that, I could survive anything. He looked at the table. Which is true up to a point. The point being that surviving isn't the same thing as living. She looked at him. No, she said quietly. It isn't. There was something in the air between them in that moment. Not yet a thing either of them could name or was willing to name, but something present nonetheless. The way you can feel weather changing before you can see it. Rhett picked up his coffee. He wasn't ready to name it either. But he didn't leave. The morning he found the wound was a Tuesday. He knew it was Tuesday because Mara kept a calendar on the wall. A simple thing, just a grid she'd drawn on a piece of brown paper, marks for each day so she could track time in a place where time could blur dangerously. And he'd started looking at it out of habit, the same way he'd started making sure there was water heating on the stove when she came in from the barn cold, and the same way he'd started splitting enough wood for the next day before the current day was done. Small habits, small calibrations to someone else's life. He found the wound while changing his shirt in the loft. It was on his left side, below the ribs, a place he'd gotten a gash from a deadfall tree back in November when he'd been moving through the forest in the dark. He'd cleaned it as well as he could with the limited supplies he'd had, and it had seemed to close, and he'd told himself it was fine. He'd been wrong. It wasn't fine. The skin around it was hot and discolored, and there was a smell that he recognized and did not want to recognize, and when he pressed on it, he felt something shift underneath that wasn't right. He sat in the loft for a long time. He thought about the photograph. He thought about the man with the earnest face and the knocked-over cider. He thought about what Mara had told him. Started as nothing, and then it wasn't nothing. He climbed down from the loft. She was at the stove. She turned when she heard him on the ladder, and something in his face must have told her because she set down what she was holding immediately. "What?" she said. He didn't answer right away. Looked at the floor. Looked at her. "I've got an infection," he said. "On my side. I think it's been there for a while." She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hand out. "Let me see." He lifted his shirt. He watched her face very carefully. She looked at the wound for a long time without expression. Then she looked up at him, and there was something in her gray-green eyes that he didn't have a word for. Not fear exactly, but the controlled, deliberate opposite of panic. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was completely steady. He sat down. She turned to the stove and lifted the water kettle and poured more water into the pot already heating there, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who has decided exactly what needs to happen next and is going to make it happen. "This is going to be unpleasant," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Do you trust me?" He thought about that for a moment. Thought about the hay, the bowl on the table, the 2 mugs of coffee at dawn, the level, straight look that had not changed since the beginning. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the wind picked up. The cabin boards groaned, the lamp flickered, and Mara Whitlock started preparing for the fight of both their lives. The water took too long to boil. That was the thing Rhett fixed on while he sat at the table waiting, the simple, infuriating slowness of water coming to heat. He watched the pot, and he watched Mara moving around the cabin with the organized efficiency of someone who had already decided that feeling afraid was a luxury she couldn't afford right now, and he thought about the wound in his side and tried to be honest with himself about how long it had actually been there. November. The deadfall tree, a dark forest, moving too fast because he'd heard something behind him. Probably nothing, probably just wind, but by November his nerves had been in the kind of shape where every sound was a threat. The branch had caught him clean under the left ribs, and he'd gone down hard in the snow and lay there for a moment looking up through the spruce canopy at the black sky, taking inventory of what worked and what didn't. Nothing felt broken. The gash was bleeding, but not badly. He'd packed snow against it, which he knew was not ideal but was what he had, and he'd kept moving. He told himself it was fine. He told himself that approximately 40 times since November, and each time it got a little easier to believe because the alternative was to stop and do something about it. And stopping in November in the high country was not really an option he had. "How long?" Mara said without turning from the stove. He looked at her back. "Since November." A silence, not a comfortable one. "That's 3 months," she said, "closer to 3.5. She turned around. She wasn't holding anything, and she wasn't doing anything, just standing there looking at him with an expression that was working very hard to stay neutral. "You've been walking around with a rotting wound in your side for 3.5 months. He didn't say anything. "And it didn't occur to you to mention this." "It seemed closed," he said. "It seemed like it was healing. It seemed." She turned back to the stove. Her shoulders were tight in a way they hadn't been 10 minutes ago. "Men," she said under her breath, and it wasn't really directed at him so much as at some broader and deeply frustrating category. He couldn't argue with it. She gathered what she needed with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. The water, now finally beginning to send up a thin curl of steam. The bottle of whiskey kept on the high shelf. He hadn't known it was there. She'd never offered it in 3 weeks of evenings, and its existence up there said something about her relationship with things that hurt. A clean cloth she tore into strips at the table, her hands quick and sure. The small knife she kept on the kitchen shelf, the blade thin and sharp, the handle worn smooth from use. She set all of it out on the table in a row. Then she pulled her chair around to his side of the table and sat down close. "Take your shirt off," she said. He did. She looked at the wound for a long moment in the lamplight, longer than she'd looked at it before, when it had just been a quick assessment. This was different. This was the look of someone mapping a problem, calculating angles, deciding on a sequence. He watched her face while she did it and saw the things she was trying not to show. A ripple of something across her expression, brief and controlled, that he recognized as the specific effort it takes to look at something frightening and keep your hands steady. "It needs to be opened," she said. "I know. It's going to hurt badly. I know that too." She looked up at him. Up close, with the lamp between them, he could see things he hadn't been able to see across the table. The fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight rawness along her lower lip where she'd been pressing it with her teeth, probably for weeks without knowing. The controlled steadiness in her face that wasn't calm exactly, but was the determined shape calm makes when a person refuses to let themselves be anything else. "The last time I did something like this," she said, "it didn't work." He held her gaze. "I know. I'm telling you so that you understand I'm not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "So you understand that I know what can go wrong." "Mara." He said her name quietly, and she stopped. "I trust you. That hasn't changed." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up the whiskey bottle and uncorked it and handed it to him. "Drink some of that." He drank. It was rough whiskey, the kind that had no interest in being enjoyed and was purely functional, and it burned all the way down and sat in his stomach like a coal. "More," she said. He drank more. "Now lie back." He shifted in the chair and braced himself against the table's edge. She pushed the lamp closer and leaned in, and he fixed his eyes on the ceiling and the rough boards up there and the shadows the lamp threw across them, and he set his jaw. What she did next was not something he would describe in detail afterward, even to himself. It was the kind of thing that existed in a separate category of experience, not filed under pain exactly, though pain was certainly present in abundance, filed under necessity. The specific category of things that have to happen and therefore do, and you get through them by making your mind go somewhere else and letting your body handle it. He made a sound at one point that he was not proud of. She didn't react to it, didn't pause, didn't flinch, didn't offer comfort she didn't have time for. She worked with the focused attention of someone who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. Her hands were steady. He noticed that in particular, in the moments when he was able to notice things, her hands, holding the knife and the cloth and the hot water, were completely steady. He didn't know how long it took. It felt like it took a year, and it probably took 40 minutes. When it was over, she sat back and set the knife down on the table and pressed the clean cloth against his side and held it there with firm, even pressure, and neither of them spoke for a while. He stared at the ceiling and breathed. She sat beside him with both hands pressed to the cloth and her head slightly bowed, and he could see from the angle of her neck and the set of her shoulders that whatever she'd been holding back during the work was now costing her to keep held. "You did good," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Don't tell me that yet," she said. "Ask me in 3 days." He almost smiled. "All right." She changed the cloth, pressed it again, started wrapping his side with strips of the torn fabric, working efficiently, the lamplight making everything amber and close. "He didn't make any sound," she said. Rhett didn't ask who. He knew. He was quiet the whole time. I thought that meant he was handling it better than I expected. She tied off the wrapping, smoothed it once with her palm, checking the tension. It just meant it had gone too far already. She stood and started cleaning up. Systematic. The knife into the basin, the used cloth set aside, the whiskey bottle recorked and returned to its high shelf. He watched her do all of this and felt the particular helplessness of a person who can't do anything useful and knows it. "That's not going to happen this time," he said. She stopped with her back to him. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I know you got to it, and that's the difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then she finished putting things away, and she came back to the table, and she looked at him, at the wrapped side, at his face, at the general ragged state of him in the lamplight, and she said, "You need to be in the bed, not the loft, the actual bed." "Mara, don't argue with me about this right now." She said it without heat, just fact. "You're not climbing that ladder for at least 3 days, and we both know it, so don't waste the breath." He didn't argue. She helped him to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, a room he'd never been in, the door always simply closed, and he registered in some dim part of his awareness that this was the room she and Daniel had shared, the room where Daniel had died, and that she was putting him in it anyway. The bed was narrow, and the quilts were heavy, and the pillow smelled faintly of cedar from the chest it had presumably been stored in. He was asleep before she left the room. The fever came in the night. He knew it by the way the darkness changed quality. Too hot, too pressing, the kind of dark that has weight to it. He was aware of being very cold and very hot simultaneously, which made no sense, and of the ceiling doing something it wasn't supposed to do, and of someone putting a cool cloth on his forehead at some point that might have been an hour later or might have been 5. "Still here," he heard himself say. "I know." Her voice close by. "Be quiet." He tried to be quiet. The fever did what fevers do. It moved through him like weather, alternately burning and shaking, reducing everything to its most essential components. There was the ceiling, there was the weight of the quilts, there was the cloth, changed periodically, cool and then warm and then cool again. There was her voice occasionally, saying practical things in a practical tone, "Drink this, hold still, don't pull at that." And the sound of it was something he organized the rest of the confusion around, the way you orient by a fixed point in the dark. At some point in what felt like the depths of the worst of it, he said something. He didn't know what. She answered him, and whatever she said didn't make full sense, but the steadiness of her voice made sense, and he held on to that. He was aware, in the fragmented way of high fever, that she didn't sleep. Or if she slept, it wasn't for long. Every time something pulled him back toward consciousness, she was there. In the chair she'd pulled beside the bed, or standing at the basin, or simply there, in the room, a presence his body had apparently decided to trust, even when his mind wasn't functional enough to participate in the decision. The fever broke at dawn on the second day. He knew it broke because the ceiling stopped moving and the quilt stopped feeling like a physical threat, and he was suddenly aware of being very thirsty and very empty and not in immediate danger. He turned his head. She was in the chair, her chin on her chest, asleep. She didn't look peaceful asleep. She looked like someone who'd fallen asleep because the choice was taken away from her. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 days ago, or maybe they had, and he hadn't noticed, and her hair had come half down from where it was pinned, and her hands were in her lap in the loose way of total exhaustion. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ceiling. Outside, the first birds of morning were starting up somewhere. That small, tentative winter sound, a bird testing whether it was safe yet. It called twice, went quiet, called again. He thought about what it cost her to sit in this room. He hadn't let himself think about it directly, in the conscious surface way. Had acknowledged it and then moved on, the way you do with things that are too large to look at straight. But now, lying in the gray morning light with the fever finally gone, and his body beginning the slow inventory of what it had spent to fight this thing, he let himself think about it fully. She had put him in its room. She had sat in that chair in this room for 2 days because that was where he needed her to be. She had done the thing that needed doing, even though every object in this room was charged with a kind of loss he couldn't fully imagine, because doing the thing that needed doing was who she was, down at the structural level. "I know what can go wrong," she'd said, and she'd done it anyway. He didn't have words for what that was. He wasn't sure he'd ever had words for a thing like that. He cleared his throat. She startled awake immediately. The light sleeper's response, snapping from sleep to full attention with no visible transition. Her eyes found him, and she assessed him in approximately 1 second. "Fever's down," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." She stood up and came to the bed and put her hand on his forehead in the direct, unsentimental way she touched everything, checking, not comforting. Then she took her hand away. "You look terrible," she said. "You don't look your best either," he said. Something moved across her face. Not offense, more like the involuntary response to something unexpectedly true. "No," she agreed. "I probably don't." She brought him water and made him drink the whole cup, and then she brought him broth she'd kept simmering on the back of the stove, thin and savory, too much salt, and absolutely what he needed. And she stood in the doorway while he drank it and watched him with the careful vigilance of someone who is not yet ready to believe the crisis is over. "You need to eat," she said. "I'm eating." "More than broth." "Give me an hour." She gave him an hour. She came back with bread and a small piece of cheese and an egg she'd soft-boiled, and she sat in the chair while he ate it and didn't say anything. The morning light had improved by then, the pale winter sun finding its angle through the bedroom window, and it lay across the foot of the bed in a long stripe. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said, "but you don't have to say it." She looked at the window rather than at him. "You would have done the same." He thought about that, realized she was right, and also that she'd known that about him before he had. "How did you know that?" 4 weeks ago, I was a stranger in your barn." She looked back at him then. "You fixed the latch," she said simply. "You didn't have to do that. You were planning to leave, and you did it anyway." She paused. "That tells a person something." He was quiet. "You're not a complicated man to read," she said, not unkindly. "Most people haven't been able to read me at all. Most people probably weren't paying the right kind of attention." He looked at his hands. The broth had put some warmth back into him, and the egg had taken the edge off the hollow feeling, and he was not, he realized with a small, startled clarity, miserable. He was in pain and weak, and his side was a mess, and he was going to be useless for at least a week, and he was not miserable. That was strange. That was a strange thing to notice about yourself. He spent 3 more days in the bed. Not from choice. The first day he tried to get up and made it approximately as far as the bedroom doorway before his legs registered their opinion on the matter, and he sat down on the floor, which was undignified. Mara appeared from somewhere, looked at him on the floor and said, "The bed is right there," and helped him back to it without further comment. She brought him meals. She managed the barn and the chickens and the wood box and the stove all by herself, which meant her days were 12 hours of work, and her evenings were shorter than they should have been because she was still checking on him before she went to sleep. He listened to her move around the cabin in the evenings, the particular sounds of her, the specific rhythm of how she closed the stove damper and set the morning coffee to steep and moved from window to window, checking the weather before she turned in. And those sounds organized themselves into something that felt uncomfortably close to comfort. He wasn't sure what to do with that. On the 4th day, he made it to the table for breakfast. She set his plate down without ceremony and sat across from him with her own, and they ate. And it felt entirely normal in a way that was itself not normal at all, given that a week ago he'd been delirious with fever in her dead husband's bed. "The north fence bracing held," she said. "Good. But the trough is leaking again, different seam." He looked at her. "I'll look at it this week." "You'll look at it when you're actually able to stand up for more than 20 minutes. That might be today." "It will not be today." He looked at his plate. "You're difficult. You tried to walk out of your sickbed and ended up sitting on the floor," she said. "You don't get to have opinions about difficult." He almost laughed. Something shifted up through his chest. Actual laughter, rusty and surprising, the kind that hurts a little when you're not used to it. He held it down because laughing with a wound in your side is ambitious, but the shape of it was there, and from the look on her face, she saw it. She looked down at her plate quickly, but not before he saw that she was fighting the same thing. They ate the rest of breakfast without speaking, and the silence was completely different from the silences of the first week, which had been the careful quiet of two strangers managing proximity. This was something that had been broken in and used, and was now comfortable in the way that broken-in things are. He helped with dishes after breakfast, standing at the basin while she dried, and that was the full extent of his usefulness that day, and he found he didn't mind it as much as he expected to. She worked beside him without comment, close enough that her shoulder occasionally touched his arm, and she didn't move away from those contacts, and neither did he. Outside, the snow was doing something, softening at the edges in a way that might, in another few weeks, become something other than snow. Not yet, but the possibility of it was out there. The season thinking about turning, the way seasons do when you're not paying attention to them. That evening, he sat in his chair at the table. His chair, he'd started thinking of it as the same way he'd started thinking of the loft and the wood box and the particular third step on the rope ladder that had a soft spot he now automatically skipped. And he worked on the harness piece he'd set aside when the fever hit. She sat across from him with her mending. The lamp burned between them. He set the harness down after a while and looked at it and then looked at her. She was bent over something, a shirt this time, collar worn through, needle working carefully around the edge of the repair. She had the specific focus she brought to things she cared about doing well, a slight compression around her eyes. Her lower lip caught briefly between her teeth. "Mara." She looked up. He didn't have a sentence to follow the name with. He'd set it to create a moment, and now the moment was here, and he didn't have the words he'd thought he might have. He looked at the lamp, looked at his hands. "I'm not leaving," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know you're not asking me to stay," he said. "I know that's not what this is, but I wanted to say it directly because I don't—" He stopped, tried again. "I've been a person who leaves, for a long time, and I want you to know that I know the difference between this and that." She was quiet for a long moment. The needle was still in her hand, a length of thread hanging from it, catching the lamplight. "This is just winter," she said. "Spring comes and the world opens back up, and people remember they have places to be." "I don't have a place to be." "You had the mountains. The mountains don't care whether I'm there or not." He looked at her. "You do." She opened her mouth, closed it. There was something moving across her face that she was clearly not prepared to name any more than he was. "That's not a reason to stay," she said finally, feeling needed. "No," he agreed, "but it's not the reason I'm staying." "Then what is?" He looked around the cabin, at the patched walls and the repaired stove, and the calendar on the wall with its careful rows of marks, and the two chairs at the table and the wood box he'd been keeping filled and the harness in his hands and the lamp between them. "I'm staying because this is the first place in 10 years that feels like it's worth staying for," he said. "That's it. That's the whole reason." She looked at him for a long time. Her face didn't change exactly, but something behind her face did. Something settled or shifted or let go of a tension it had been holding for months. She looked down at her mending. "The trough," she said. "Yeah. When you're actually able to stand." "When I'm actually able to stand," he agreed. She went back to her needle, and he went back to the harness, and the fire crackled in the wood stove, and outside the snow sat on the fields in the particular blue-dark quiet of a frontier night, and neither of them said anything else. But the chair across from her was occupied, and she didn't have to fall asleep alone in the sound of the wind. And those were not small things. Those were, in fact, the kind of things that don't look like much from the outside and are everything from the inside. And both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. The season kept building towards something, the way seasons do. Neither of them was in a hurry to name what it was. The trough took him 4 hours to fix properly. It was the second week of his recovery, the first week he'd been able to work outside for a full morning, without his legs staging a quiet revolt. And he spent those 4 hours belly down over the side of the water trough, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and pine tar on his hands, and a growing conviction that whoever had originally built this trough had made a series of enthusiastic structural decisions that made no engineering sense whatsoever. He said as much to Mara when she came out at mid-morning with coffee. "Daniel built it," she said. He looked at the trough, then at her. "He was very good at some things," she said with the flat honesty of someone who had spent years working around a specific blind spot and was no longer defensive about it. "Carpentry wasn't one of them." Rhett looked back at the trough. "No," he agreed. She handed him the coffee, and he drank it crouching beside the trough, and she leaned against the barn wall with her own cup and watched him work, and it was one of those moments that didn't require talking. He finished the coffee and handed back the mug and went back to the pine tar, and she went back inside, and that was enough. By the time he called it done, the sun had moved well past noon, and his side was aching in the way it did when he'd pushed it further than was strictly advisable. He ignored this and replaced his tools in the barn corner and washed his hands in the bucket of cold water by the barn door and then stood in the yard for a moment doing nothing. The air had changed. It was subtle. The frontier never made dramatic announcements. But it was there. Something in the quality of the cold. Less aggressive. The snow still deep everywhere, still white, but at the south-facing edge of the yard where the afternoon sun hit longest, there was a thin strip of dark earth showing. A finger's width. Maybe 2. He stood and looked at that strip of earth for a while. Spring was still weeks away, maybe more. Up here in the high country, winter didn't surrender without a fight. He'd seen April snowstorms that would have humiliated a December. But the earth remembering it existed under all that white was something. He found it meant something to him in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about planting. Whether her fields were already turned from last fall, or whether that was still to be done. He thought about fencing. The north section needed proper post work as soon as the ground softened enough to take the digger. He thought about the list of things that spring would uncover and demand. He was thinking about spring here, at this homestead, as if spring was something that would include him. He noticed that and walked back inside. Mara was at the table with papers spread out in front of her. Accounts, he realized when he came closer. A ledger, worn at the spine, the columns filled in with her careful, even handwriting. She was bent over it with a pencil in her hand and the expression she got when something wasn't adding up the way she needed it to. She didn't look up. "Trough fixed?" "Fixed. The seam repair on the south end will hold, but the east end wall is soft. Needs new boards in the next month, or it'll start to fail. I'll add it to the list." He sat down across from her. The ledger was open to a page of numbers that, even from across the table, he could see were doing things he didn't think she wanted them to do. "Bad?" She looked up and she had the expression of a person deciding whether to answer that honestly. She decided. "The winter was expensive, more than I planned for." She set the pencil down. "I lost 2 goats in October before Daniel died. Predator, probably mountain lion. And then the week after the funeral, one of the horses came up lame. She's fine now, but the farrier came from the valley, and it cost what it cost." "How much did it cost?" She told him. He kept his face even. "And then the storm took out a section of the chicken coop roof in January," she said, "and I had to pay the Hendersons from the next valley over to come help me get it back up because I couldn't do it alone, and that was—" She named a number that was smaller, but compounded the problem. He looked at the ledger. "Can I?" She turned it toward him. He looked at the columns for a while. He wasn't a ledger man, had never been much for numbers on paper, but he understood practical accounting the way anyone who'd survived by their own labor understood it. Inputs, outputs, margins. What you had and what you needed, and the distance between them. "It's not impossible," he said. "I didn't say it was impossible. You've got the livestock. The laying hens alone cover a portion of this if you're selling eggs to the valley." "I do sell eggs to the valley." She leaned forward. "Twice a month, weather permitting, which in winter means once a month if I'm lucky. The nearest settlement is 4 hours by horse. So we go more often when the road's open." She looked at him at the word we. He hadn't planned to say it that way. It had come out that way because that was how he was thinking, apparently, and it sat on the table between them for a second before she looked back at the ledger. "There's also the matter of seed," she said. "I need to expand the kitchen garden this year. If I can get 2 more rows of beans and a proper potato section going, I can put up enough to actually get through next winter without buying as much from the settlement. But the seed costs—" "I have money," Rhett said. She looked up. "Not a lot," he said, "but I've got what I got from last year's trapping before the season went wrong. It's been sitting in my pack doing nothing. If it would help get the seed—" "I'm not taking your money," she said. "I'm not offering to give it to you. I'm offering to put it toward the place." He held her look. "That's different." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through the pride of it and the practicality of it, the same internal negotiation she probably ran a dozen times a day. What she could afford to refuse and what she couldn't. "We can talk about it when we know what the seed prices are," she said finally. That was not a no. He understood that and let it sit. He was outside the next morning when the feeling in his side changed. He'd been aware of the wound's progress the way you're aware of something healing. The daily texture of it. The slow gradient from sharp pain to dull ache to the particular deep itching that meant tissue rebuilding itself. He'd been changing the wrapping himself for the past week, Mara having shown him how and then handed the job off to him with the pragmatism of someone with a lot of other things to do. It hadn't been right yesterday, if he was honest. A little more heat than it should have. A little more swelling at the edges. He'd told himself it was fine. There it was again. That phrase. The same stubborn, stupid thing his brain reached for when the alternative was inconvenient. He'd been 3.5 months in the mountains telling himself a rotting wound was fine, and now here he was 2 weeks out from nearly dying of that exact wound, and his first instinct was still to not say anything. He went inside. Mara was at the stove. She turned when he came in, read his face in the way she'd gotten efficient at, and said, "What?" "The wound," he said. "It might not be done." She crossed the room and he lifted his shirt, and she looked, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and the not saying anything was its own kind of answer. "Sit down," she said. "It's not as bad as before," he said. "It's not... I think it's just... Rhett." She looked at him. "Sit down." He sat down. What followed was a quieter version of the first time, less brutal but no less determined. She'd learned from 2 weeks ago, knew the geography of it now, knew where to look and what to look for, moved with the efficiency of familiarity. He gripped the edge of the table and breathed through it, and she worked, and the lamp threw their shadows large against the wall. "It didn't fully close," she said while she worked. There's a pocket, smaller than before, but it was still there. Will it? I don't know." The words came out clipped, not from coldness, but from concentration. "I'm doing what I can do." He shut up and let her work. This time it took 20 minutes, and it was bad, but not as comprehensively bad as the first time. And when she finished and sat back, he felt shaky and wrung out, but not like he'd been taken apart and reassembled. She wrapped it again with fresh cloth, her hands moving with brisk efficiency, and then she sat back in her chair and put both her palms flat on her thighs, and just breathed for a moment with her eyes closed. He looked at her. The lamplight caught the line of her jaw, the slight tremble in her exhale that she was suppressing by an act of pure will. She'd done this twice now, gone into the same fight twice, with her hands and the knife and whatever was inside her that didn't quit, and he was beginning to understand the scope of what that cost her in ways that went past the physical. "Mara." She opened her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not saying something yesterday." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you?" He thought about that. The honest answer, not the easy one. "Because I didn't want to be a problem. I've been trying not to be a problem in this house." He paused. "That was stupid." "Yes," she said, "it was." But the heat was out of it. She said it the way she said most true things, plainly, without ornamentation. "You being sick is not the same as being a problem. You understand that." "I'm starting to." She stood up, started moving around the kitchen in her end-of-evening pattern, damping the stove, straightening things that had gotten unstraightened during the day. He watched her and noticed how the pattern of her evenings had become familiar to him, the specific sequence of her closing down routine. Window check. Stove. Water for morning. The calendar on the wall where she made her daily mark. She picked up the pencil, made the mark, then stood there a moment with the pencil in her hand, looking at the calendar before she set it down and turned around. When I was taking care of Daniel, she said, at the end, he kept telling me he was fine. Every day. I'm fine, Mara. Stop fussing. I'm fine. She looked at the wall, not at him. I knew he wasn't fine. I could see what was happening, but he kept saying it, and I let myself believe it because I needed to, and I waited 2 extra days before I sent for the doctor from the settlement. And by the time the doctor got here, it was already... She stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. He knew how it finished. He was trying to protect you, Rhett said. I know that. Her voice was even. And it killed him. She turned and looked at him directly. So when something is wrong, I need you to tell me. Not to protect me from it. Just tell me. He held her gaze. All right. I mean it. Mara, I mean it too. She looked at him for a moment longer and then she seemed to settle. Not relax exactly, but the rigid line of her came down a degree. She went back to the stove and finished her closing down, and he sat at the table and watched her, and neither of them said anything else. But something had been said that hadn't been said before, and both of them knew it. The fever came back that night, not as bad as the first time. He would make that clear to himself repeatedly in the hours that followed, because the first time had been the kind of experience that resets your scale for what bad means. And this was measurably less than that. But it was bad enough. The heat came up through him from somewhere central, and the ceiling did its moving thing again, and the quilts became alternately necessary and intolerable. She was there. He was aware of that as a constant, the way you're aware of the fixed things when everything else is shifting. The cloth on his forehead changed regularly with a precision that suggested she was not sleeping. Her voice, when he surfaced enough to be aware of voices, always the same. Practical, level, present. He had the confused sense several times that she was talking to him, actual sentences, and he couldn't track the words, but the voice itself was information enough. Still here, the voice said in its steadiness. This is not the worst thing. Stay. He stayed. The second morning he surfaced to find her asleep in the chair again, and this time he didn't wake her. He lay in the dim light of early morning and watched her sleep and thought about all the ways a person can be strong that have nothing to do with size or force. He'd spent a lot of his life understanding strength in terms of what you could carry and how far and in what weather. He was rethinking that. She woke on her own, the same snap to alertness. Found him watching her, said, "What?" with the immediate wariness of someone who's learned that being watched while asleep is usually not neutral information. "Nothing," he said. "You were sleeping." "I wasn't sleeping." "Mara, you were absolutely sleeping." She looked briefly and entirely involuntarily mortified, and then she collected herself and said, "How do you feel?" in her professional tone. "Better than yesterday." She came to the bed and did her forehead assessment. "Fever's lower." She stepped back. "Are you hungry?" "Starving." "That's a good sign." She went to the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. Didn't turn around. "The first time," she said. "When the fever broke the first time, you said something." He waited. "You said..." She paused. "You said don't go. In the middle of the night. You said it twice." He looked at the ceiling. "I don't know who you were talking to," she said. "But I wanted you to know that I didn't." She paused. "Go." She walked out without waiting for his response. He lay in the gray morning light and stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Don't go." He didn't remember saying it. Couldn't have told you with certainty who he'd meant it for. His wife, 8 years gone? His own life, which had been doing its level best to exit? Or the woman in the chair beside the bed who had refused twice to let him die? He thought maybe it didn't matter who he'd meant it for. He thought maybe what mattered was who had answered. He spent 4 days in the bed this time. Shorter than the first fever, the body having already won some of the ground and only needing to hold it. He ate everything she brought him. He didn't try to get up early. He told her on the third morning that his side felt different. A cleaner kind of pain, not the sick heat of infection, but the sharp, honest ache of actual healing. And she came and looked, and something in her face let go of a tension that had been living there for days. "It's closing," she said. "Yeah." Properly this time. She sat back. I think. Confident prognosis, he said. She looked at him sideways. Do you want me to tell you something more reassuring, or do you want me to tell you the truth? I've been wanting you to tell me the truth since I was in your barn, he said. Something shifted in her expression then, brief and unmistakable. She pressed her lips together and looked at the wound rather than at him, but not before he'd seen it. He filed that away. On the day he finally made it back to the table for breakfast under his own power, without stopping in any doorways or sitting on any floors, Mara put a plate in front of him that was noticeably more generous than the convalescent portions of the past week. 2 eggs instead of 1, a larger piece of bread, a second strip of the cured venison. He looked at the plate and looked at her. You're supposed to be getting your strength back, she said, in the tone she used when she was explaining something obvious. No argument for me, he said, and ate all of it. He was back to full work within the week, and that was when he discovered how much had been building up. She'd been managing everything alone while he was down. All of it. The barn, the livestock, the wood box, the water, the endless small maintenance of the house and yard. She'd done it without complaint and without asking for help that he wasn't able to give, and she'd kept the household running. He understood this fully only when he started picking things back up and saw what the pile of deferred work looked like. The coop repairs she'd managed had held but needed reinforcing. The water barrel at the barn had a layer of ice on it every morning now that the temperatures had dipped back down after their brief false thaw, which meant someone needed to break it each day. 2 of the fence posts on the east section were leaning, not from snow load this time, but from simple age, the wood rotting at the base, and needed replacing before they fell. He did all of it. He did it systematically, working through it the way he'd worked through things his whole life, problem to problem, without rushing and without stopping. He split the extra wood. He reinforced the coop. He broke the barrel ice every morning before she got to the barn, so she'd find it already done. She noticed. She didn't say anything directly, but he caught her once looking at the wood box, filled past the top, split pieces stacked neatly, with an expression that she smoothed over quickly when she realized he was watching. I haven't been able to keep it that full all winter, she said, almost to herself. You were doing it alone. She looked at him. You kept everything running for 4 months by yourself, he said. That's not a small thing. I want you to know I understand that. She was quiet for a moment, something working behind her eyes. Daniel was a good man, she said, but he was sick for most of October before he died, so for those months, she paused. I've been doing this alone for longer than 4 months. He didn't say anything, because nothing he could say would be adequate to that, and she didn't need adequacy. She needed the acknowledgement, and he'd given it. She turned back to the stove. I made a full pot of beans, she said. Don't let me forget them. I won't forget them, he said. They ate together that evening at the table with the beans and cornbread she'd made, and the conversation moved the way it had been moving since the fevers. More easily, less carefully, the way conversations go when the formality has been stripped out of them by shared difficulty. She told him about the spring planting rotation she was planning. He told her about a trapping technique he'd learned from a Shawnee man he'd met years ago, which led somehow to her asking about the people he'd met in the mountains, which led to him talking about the mountains themselves in a way he hadn't talked about them before. Not the practical geography of survival, but the actual experience of them. What it felt like to be in high country in early morning when the light came in low across the peaks. She listened with the focused attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. You love it, she said. The mountains. I did, he said. You don't anymore? He looked at his hands. I love them the way you love something you understand, not the way you love something you need. He paused. That's probably the first time I've been able to say that. She looked at her plate, at the table, at her hands. Daniel loved this land, she said. Genuinely loved it, the way some men do, like it was a person he'd chosen. She was quiet for a moment. I respect that. I'm good at this life because I respect it, but I'm not sure I ever loved it the way he did. She looked up. Is that a terrible thing to say? No, he said. I think it's honest. I thought it might mean I shouldn't be here. Plenty of people are where they're supposed to be without loving every inch of it, Rhett said. Loving it doesn't mean you're good at it, and not loving it doesn't mean you don't belong. She looked at him, something very direct in it. Where do you belong? She said. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. He could see that she actually wanted to know, that she was watching him with the same attention she gave to problems she was trying to understand. He looked around the cabin, at the lamp and the stove and the calendar on the wall and the patched coat on the hook by the door. "I'm starting to think," he said slowly, "that belonging isn't a place so much as a situation." "What situation?" "Being needed," he said. "Being useful. Having something worth getting up for in the morning that isn't just your own continued existence." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he started to wonder if he'd said something wrong, stepped somewhere he hadn't meant to. But when she spoke, her voice was different. Not softer exactly, but less armored. "The morning after Daniel died," she said, "I didn't know how to get out of bed. Not from grief, although that was there, but because for 6 years getting out of bed meant starting the work. And the work had always been for us, for building something that was ours together." She looked at the table. "I didn't know how to get out of bed for just me." "How did you?" "The chickens needed feeding." A small, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. Livestock are very efficient grief counselors. They don't care what you're feeling. They need what they need. He looked at her. "You got out of bed for the chickens," he said. "I got out of bed for the chickens," she confirmed. "Every morning for 4 months. And then one morning you were in my barn, and I had a reason to get out of bed that was slightly more complicated than a chicken, and—" She stopped herself, looked at her plate. The sentence had gone somewhere she hadn't intended it to go. And he could see her deciding how to handle that. He let it be. He didn't push it, didn't reach for it, didn't try to make it into something she wasn't ready to let it be. He picked up his fork and ate a bite of beans and said, "These are good. Better than last week's." She looked at him, and there was something in her gray-green eyes that might have been gratitude for exactly that, for letting the moment close without pressing it open. "I let them cook longer. Makes a difference. Everything takes as long as it takes," she said. "That's the first thing the land teaches you." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "I think you're right." Outside the cabin, the snow had begun something. Not melting yet, not truly, but settling. That slow, incremental process of compaction and retreat. The snowpack beginning to renegotiate its relationship with the earth below. The strip of dark soil at the south edge of the yard was wider now, a full hand's width. Spring was making up its mind. Neither of them was in the habit of naming things before they were ready to be named. But something had happened in this cabin over the course of a brutal winter, through infections and fevers and 2 nights in a chair beside a bed in a room that held too much of its own history. Something had been built. Not neatly, not without cost. Built the way things get built on the frontier, out of necessity and stubbornness, and the discovery that the person working beside you is someone you trust in the specific, unromantic, life or death way that matters more than any softer kind. The lamp burned on the table between them. The stove ticked and settled. Somewhere out past the dark glass of the window, the season was changing. Spring arrived the way it always did in the high country. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week in March that softened the snowpack and turned the yard to a slick, treacherous mud that clung to boots and made every trip between the cabin and the barn a negotiation. Then a hard freeze that turned the mud to ridged concrete overnight and cracked 2 of the water buckets Rhett had left outside. Then warmth again, more convincing this time, and the strip of dark earth at the south edge of the yard became a band, and the band became a field, and the field began to smell like the thing beneath winter, the wet, dense, iron and root smell of ground that's been holding its breath for 6 months and is finally letting it out. Rhett reset the fence posts on the east section the first week the ground was soft enough to take the digger. It was miserable work. The old posts had to come out first, and 2 of them had rotted so far down that they broke off below grade, and he had to dig them out by hand, kneeling in cold mud with his arms in the hole up to the elbow. He swore at length about this, which he did when he was alone, and which Mara could apparently hear from the barn, because she appeared in the barn doorway at one point with an expression that was not quite a smile and handed him a rag for his arms without comment. "I can hear you from in there," she said. "The posts are rotted through at the base," he said. "Someone should have replaced them 2 years ago." "Someone was managing alone," she said pleasantly, and went back inside. He looked at the mud on his arms and the broken post in the hole, and said one more thing about it, quietly, and went back to work. The east fence took 3 days. He replaced 6 posts, reset the rails, and drove new staples where the wire had pulled loose. He also fixed the section Mara had shown him on the west side. Not failing yet, but heading there. The posts soft enough that you could drive a thumb into the wood. He replaced those too because replacing them in May was easier than repairing the fence in July when the livestock had figured out it was negotiable. Mara noticed when she walked the fence line one morning, running her hand along the wire in the way she checked things, by feel, by years of knowing exactly what taut wire felt like and what sagging wire felt like. "You did the west section too," she said, while I had the tools out. She walked another 10 feet of fence and then stopped and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said. She didn't say things like that easily. He'd learned that. When she said them, she meant them exactly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I am." She turned and walked back toward the barn, and he watched her go and turn back to the fence, and that was that. The garden went in the second week of April. Mara had the rotation planned out on paper. She'd shown him the sketch one evening, the rows mapped carefully in her precise handwriting, bean varieties annotated with notes about which had done well in previous years and which hadn't. She knew this soil the way she knew the livestock, their specific character, their preferences, their reliable failures. He dug while she planted. She moved behind him along the turned rows, dropping seeds with the unhurried focus of someone who has learned to pace themselves because the work doesn't end, it just changes shape. They worked in easy silence that occasionally became conversation and then went back to silence without either of them noticing the transitions. The potato section took most of a morning. He built the hilling mounds while she cut the seed potatoes at the table, leaving them to dry and callus before planting. And somewhere in the middle of this, she started talking about Missouri again, about her mother's kitchen garden, the specific way her mother planted tomatoes in the same spot every year, regardless of what anyone said about crop rotation, and how those tomatoes always grew anyway because her mother believed in them hard enough that the soil didn't dare argue. Rhett listened and worked and occasionally asked a question, and she answered it, and the morning went by in that way. Companionable and domestic, and so unlike the past 10 years of his life that it still occasionally surprised him, the lack of loneliness in it. He had stopped flinching from that word, somewhere between the second fever and the east fence posts. Loneliness. He'd been lonely for a decade and called it freedom, and believed the label because the alternative was admitting what he'd actually been carrying. You can tell yourself a lot of things for long enough that they sound true. The mountains had been very good at absorbing his definitions of himself and reflecting them back unchanged, which was one of the ways they could kill you without raising a hand. The homestead didn't do that. The homestead had its own demands and its own character, and a woman with gray-green eyes who called things what they were. And the combination of these things had slowly, inexorably, dismantled every comfortable untruth he'd been walking around with. He wasn't sure he could have said exactly when he started thinking of this place as home. It hadn't been a decision. It had been more like weather, the same word he'd used before, because it kept being the right one. It had happened to him the way seasons happen, and one day he'd noticed it was already done. The morning the drifters arrived, he was behind the barn replacing a rotted board on the east wall. He heard them before he saw them, the specific sound of horses on the approach road, which in spring meant a particular sucking rhythm of hooves in mud, and voices carrying in the way voices carry on a still April morning when the air is damp and the tree line is close. 3 voices. Men's voices, with a quality to them he registered before he was conscious of registering it. He set down the board. He went around the side of the barn and looked. 3 riders in the yard. Their horses were rough-coated and badly cared for, the kind of animals that have been asked to do too much for too long without enough of what they needed. The men themselves had the look of the road, not the honest look of travelers or traders, but something else. Something that came from spending a long time operating outside the structures that keep people accountable to each other. Red had spent enough time in wild country to know the difference between men who were hard and men who were mean. And what he was looking at was the second kind. Mara was in the yard. She'd come out of the cabin, probably at the sound of the horses, and she was standing 10 feet from the porch steps with the .44 rifle that lived by the front door held across her body. Not raised, just present. She had the relaxed grip of a person who knows how to use a thing and is not yet using it but has not ruled out using it. help you?" she said. The man in front, heavy-set, with a red, wind-burned face and something wrong about the set of his eyes, too close together and too flat, looked at the rifle and then at her and seemed to make an assessment that Rhett had seen before. A woman alone is a temporary problem. "We're traveling through," the man said, "hungry. Figured a place like this might have food to spare." "I might," Mara said, "if you've got something to trade. We're a little short on trade goods right now." The flat-eyed man smiled. It didn't improve his face. "We were hoping for the neighborly approach." "This isn't particularly neighborly country," she said. Rhett had stayed in the corner of the barn. He was evaluating. 3 men, 3 horses, the man in front doing the talking. The second man, younger, angular, with the twitchy quality of someone who runs on too little sleep, had his horse positioned to the left, slightly behind. The third man was the one Rhett watched most carefully. He was very still in the saddle, very quiet. Not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of a person waiting for a specific moment. The third man had his hand near his coat. Rhett moved along the barn wall, away from the corner, further around toward the back pasture side. He moved quietly, the way he'd moved through wilderness for 14 years. If they'd been paying attention, they might have heard him in the mud, but they weren't paying attention to the barn. They were paying attention to Mara, which was the point. "Just some bread," the flat-eyed man said. Maybe some salt pork if you have it. We'll be on our way." "And your horses?" Mara said. "I notice you're looking at my corral." A pause. The flat-eyed man's smile shifted slightly. "Fine animals you've got." "They're not available." "Everything's available," he said, "at the right price." "I told you I'm not interested in—" "Lady." His voice changed. Not loud, but the pleasantness went out of it completely. "We've been riding 3 days. We're tired and we're hungry and we're not asking anymore." The young one moved his horse forward. Mara raised the rifle. "That's close enough," she said. And it was. She had the young one stopped, the barrel at a height that communicated extremely specific intent, and Rhett could see from where he now stood, at the rear corner of the barn, not 30 feet from the third rider's back, that she was not shaking. Her hands on that rifle were steady, but there were 3 of them and 1 of her. The third man's hand moved inside his coat. Rhett came around the corner. He came fast and he came quiet, and he hit the third rider before the man had finished whatever he was reaching for inside that coat. He pulled him straight out of the saddle, used his momentum and the man's own weight and the height differential of a mounted man, and got him down into the mud with a force that knocked the air out of him comprehensively. The horse shied sideways, whinnying, and suddenly the yard was noise and confusion. The young one's horse spooked from the commotion, and he had to fight it, which put his attention on the animal instead of the rifle. The flat-eyed man turned in his saddle and saw Rhett standing over the third rider in the mud, and what the flat-eyed man saw made him very still. Rhett looked like what he was. 6'3" of a man who had spent the better part of his life in circumstances that had stripped away everything non-essential and left something very direct in its place. He was standing in the mud with his fists at his sides, and he was not doing anything aggressive, not yet. But the stillness of him was its own statement. "Get off my property," Mara said. Her voice hadn't changed. Still level, still completely even. "All 3 of you." The man in the mud was making sounds suggesting he'd rediscovered breathing but wasn't enjoying it. He had sense enough not to reach for anything. The young one had his horse under control now. He looked at the flat-eyed man with something that was clearly a question. "What do we do?" The flat-eyed man looked at Rhett, looked at the rifle, looked at his friend in the mud. "Get up," the flat-eyed man said to the third man. Not to Rhett, not to Mara. Just a flat order to the man in the mud, and his voice had the quality of someone deciding that this specific situation is not worth what it's going to cost. The third man got up. He was careful about it, careful not to reach, careful not to make any motion that could be misread. He found his horse and got back into the saddle without looking at Rhett, which was probably the smartest thing he'd done all day. The 3 of them moved to the gate without another word. The flat-eyed man stopped there and turned and looked at the homestead, at Mara with the rifle, at Rhett in the yard. And the look had a memory to it, the kind that says, "I know where this is." Then he turned his horse and they went down the approach road, the mud sucking at the hooves, and the trees took them. The yard was quiet. Mara lowered the rifle. She held it at her side and let out one long, controlled breath. Rhett was still standing in the mud where the third man had been. He became aware, now that the moment had resolved itself, that his hands were hurting. He'd hit the ground coming down, catching himself, and the palms were scraped raw. He looked at them. He became aware of something else, too. Something he needed to look at directly. He turned. Mara was watching him. She had the rifle in one hand, and she was watching him the way she'd watched him the first morning in the barn. Assessing, measuring, taking stock of something. He tried to read her face and found he couldn't, not precisely, and that scared him more than the three men had. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." He wiped his hands on his thighs. "You?" "No." She looked at the gate where the riders had gone. "They might come back." "They might," he said. "I don't think they will." He paused. Men like that look for the easy thing. This stopped being the easy thing. She nodded slowly, then she looked back at him, and whatever she'd been reading in his face, she'd apparently finished reading it. "Come inside," she said. "Let me look at your hands." "They're fine. Rhett." He stopped. She had her eyes on him with the exact specific level look she'd been giving him since February. The look that had not changed once through the fevers and the infections and the fence posts and the garden and all the accumulated ordinary difficulty of 5 months of frontier winter. The look that said, "I see what's there, not what you're showing me, and you know that, so stop performing." "Come inside," she said again. Quieter this time. He came inside. She put the rifle back on its hooks by the door. She went to the stove and heated water with the same routine efficiency she brought to every crisis. And she brought the basin to the table and sat across from him and cleaned the scrapes on his palms without speaking. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. He watched the top of her head while she worked and thought about the way she'd been standing in the yard, 10 feet from the steps, rifle across her body, voice completely level, while 3 armed men told her they were taking what they wanted. He thought about what it had cost her to stand there that way and not show what it cost. "You weren't scared," he said. She didn't look up. "I was scared." "You didn't show it. Showing it doesn't help." She dried his left hand and started on the right. "I learned that early. Fear is fine. Fear means you understand the situation, but you don't hand it to the people who are hoping you'll feel it." He looked at her hands on his. "Daniel teach you that?" "No." A pause. "I taught myself that after Daniel." She smoothed a piece of cloth over the scrape on his right palm and held it there for a moment. Daniel would have shown it. He wore everything on his face. It was one of the things I loved about him. She let go of his hand. It was also how I always knew when something was wrong before he told me. He thought about the fever. "I'm fine, Mara." He thought about himself in November, 3.5 months of telling himself the wound was fine. "I'm working on that," he said. She looked up. "I know you are." A pause. "You're better than you were." High bar. Most bars on this frontier are. Something moved through her expression, brief and slightly tired, and not without humor. She sat back and looked at him across the table. "They'll talk," she said. "Men like that. They'll move on to the next settlement and tell people what happened here. That there's a woman with a rifle and a..." She paused. "And a man." "And a man," he agreed. "That changes things." She said it evenly, but she was watching him while she said it, and there was a question underneath the statement that she wasn't quite asking directly. "It changes things," he said. "It means they know the place isn't undefended." "Yes." "Which means..." She stopped, looked at the table, then looked back up. "Which means it matters whether you're here, practically speaking." He looked at her, at the gray-green eyes and the straight edge of her jaw, and the small scar above her left eyebrow, and the way she always came at things sideways when she cared about them, because direct was too exposed. He'd learned that about her, how her straightforwardness about practical things was actually a kind of armor, and the things she really meant she wrapped in practicality, so they'd be harder to refuse. "Mara," he said. "What?" "Ask me directly." A silence. She looked at him with the level look, and for once something moved in it. Not softness exactly, but the thing that sits underneath steadiness when the steadiness is not the natural condition, but the chosen one. "Are you staying?" she said. Yes, he said. Through spring. Through spring, he said, and past it. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at the basin and the cloth on the table and the general ordinary wreckage of the afternoon. All right, she said. She stood and took the basin to the window and tipped the water out, and he watched her move around the kitchen in the evening light. The amber of it catching her hair, the one loose strand she'd stopped bothering to pin back sometime in March. She hung the cloth to dry and came back to the stove and started the supper, and the cabin settled around them in its familiar sounds. He got up and filled the wood box. She didn't tell him to. He did it because it was empty and the evening was coming, and those were the only reasons needed. He went in and out twice with armfuls of split wood, and she worked at the stove, and neither of them said anything. The lamp came on. The smell of cooking filled the cabin. Outside in the last light, the spring fields were very green at their edges where the new grass was coming in, and the fence posts he'd reset stood straight along the east section, and the approach road was empty. He sat down at his chair. She put a plate in front of him and sat across from him at hers. They ate. The conversation that came eventually was about seeds. Specifically, the bean variety she was concerned had gone too long in storage and might not germinate, and what she planned to do about it. He listened and offered the one useful thought he had, which was that you didn't know until you planted them, and the worrying in advance cost the same as the worrying after, so you might as well wait. She said that was easy to say. He said he knew that. She said she supposed the worst case was she replanted in 2 weeks with the backup stock. He said that sounded like a plan. She pushed a piece of cornbread toward him without being asked, because she'd noticed he'd been eyeing it. He took it. The evening moved on. The lamp burned steady. The stove ticked. Outside the window, the frontier went about its business, dark and wide and indifferent, the way it had always been, full of things that didn't care whether you were ready for them. But the door was shut against it, and there were 2 people on the same side of that door, and that, on the frontier, was everything. 3 days after the drifters, Rhett found their tracks again. He hadn't gone looking. He'd been following the fence line on the north section, checking the wire after a night of hard wind, and the tracks were simply there in the soft mud of the approach road. 3 sets of hoof prints heading back toward the property before veering off into the tree line about a quarter mile out. They'd come back, stopped, then turned around and left. He stood in the mud and looked at the tree line for a long time. Then he went back to the cabin. Mara was at the table with the ledger when he came in. She looked up, read his face, and set the pencil down. He told her what he'd found. She was quiet for a moment. They scouted us. Looks like. And then left. And then left, he confirmed. She thought about that. He could see her working through it. The practical calculation of a woman who had been running threat assessments on this property since October, weighing what was real against what was possible, and deciding how much of her energy each category deserved. They saw the same thing they saw before, she said finally, and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. That's my read. She picked the pencil back up, looked at the ledger. I'll start keeping the rifle closer, she said, just as a habit. Good habit, he said. She made a mark in the ledger. There's coffee on the stove. He poured coffee and stood at the window and looked at the approach road in the morning light, and after a while the tension in his shoulders settled, and he drank his coffee, and the morning moved on. That was the thing about the frontier that nobody told you before you got there. Most of the fear was maintenance. The actual catastrophes were rare. What was constant was the low-grade vigilance, the daily assessment of what could go wrong and what you'd do about it. The understanding that you were never more than one bad decision or one unlucky season away from something serious. The people who broke under frontier life didn't usually break under the catastrophes. They broke under the maintenance, under the weight of never being able to fully put the vigilance down. Rhett had carried his vigilance alone for 14 years. He'd thought that was just the condition of the life he'd chosen. That the weight was the weight, and you either carried it or you didn't, and there was no third option. He was discovering there was a third option. You could carry it with someone. It didn't make it lighter, exactly. The weight was the same, but there was something categorically different about putting it down in the evening at a table across from another person and saying, here's what I saw today, here's what I'm watching for, here's what I think, and having someone say, I see it too, or I think you're wrong about that part, or just yes. That exchange, that daily mutual accounting, was something he hadn't known he was missing until he had it, and now he couldn't imagine going back to the alternative. May came in with warmth that meant it. The kitchen garden was in and growing, tentatively at first, the thin green lines of bean sprouts raising themselves out of the dark soil with the cautious optimism of things that have been underground for a long time and aren't entirely sure the world is ready for them yet. The potato mounds were doing what potato mounds did, which was mostly nothing visible but presumably a great deal underground. The backup bean seeds, the ones Mara had worried about, had germinated fine. She had not said "I told you so" about the worrying, but she had looked at the sprouts with an expression that suggested she was filing this as a data point. Rhett had the fields to turn. The fields were the larger project, the actual crop fields beyond the kitchen garden, the ones that grew the feed corn and the winter wheat and the kitchen staples that the garden couldn't supply in enough volume. Daniel had been turning them by hand with the horse-drawn plow, which was back-breaking work that Rhett now understood would have been barely manageable for two people and was frankly alarming to think about one person attempting alone. He and Mara worked the fields together through the first 2 weeks of May. She drove the gray draft horse on the plow lines while he managed the plow itself. Not because she couldn't do it alone, but because this way they covered the ground in half the time, and neither of them ended the day destroyed. They worked in the long spring days with the sun tracking across a sky that was finally and unambiguously blue, and the turned earth behind them had the clean, dark smell that meant things were possible. They talked while they worked. Not constantly. There were long periods of just the creak of harness and the sound of the earth turning and the distant commentary of birds establishing territories in the tree line. But the conversation that did happen was different from the careful, managed exchanges of the winter. It moved more freely now. It doubled back on itself, wandered into subjects and out of them, allowed for disagreement. They disagreed, as it turned out, about a number of things. She thought he was wrong about which corner of the west field would drain best in a wet year. He thought she was wrong about how much seed corn to put in versus winter wheat, given what he understood the market prices to be in the valley. She thought he was being too conservative about the potato yield estimate. He thought she was being too optimistic. These arguments happened the way good arguments between capable people happen. Directly, without drama, with actual information on both sides. And they resolved into compromises that were usually better than either original position. Rhett had not had this experience of being argued with by someone who was actually right about half the time. It was, he found, one of the more useful things that had ever happened to him. One evening in the middle of May, after supper, she brought the ledger to the table and showed him what the winter accounting looked like now, with the spring work factored in. The picture was better, not comfortable. Some frontier accounting was rarely comfortable, but navigable. The egg money from the valley runs they'd been doing twice a month since the roads cleared was steadier than she'd had it before, partly because Rhett went with her now, which meant they could bring more and sell more and get back before dark without the margin of risk that had constrained her solo trips. The seed had gone in on time, which meant the harvest projections were realistic rather than hopeful. The livestock were in better condition than they'd been in October. She set the pencil down and looked at the numbers and then looked at him. "It's going to be all right," she said, slightly surprised the way a person sounds when they've been braced for bad news for long enough that good news requires adjustment. "It's going to be all right," he said. She closed the ledger, sat back, looked at the ceiling in the way she did when she was processing something she hadn't let herself process yet. "I wasn't sure," she said, "after October. I wasn't sure this place was going to survive. The farm, I mean." She paused. "Or me, honestly." He looked at her. She was saying something real, something from the interior layer she didn't often let surface, and he was careful with it. "But you kept getting out of bed." "I kept getting out of bed," she agreed, a small sound that was tired and wry and completely genuine. "Every morning, for the chickens." "For the chickens," he said. She looked at him. The lamp between them was burning low, the oil getting down, and the light it threw was amber and close, and it caught the lines at the corners of her eyes and the silver thread in her hair that he'd noticed in March and hadn't mentioned. She looked like a person who had been through something and come out the other side of it with the pieces still in her hands, not neatly reassembled, but still present. He thought she was the most honest person he'd ever sat across a table from. "I have something to say," he said. She looked at him steadily. He hadn't planned this. He'd thought about it, thought around it, in the way he thought about things he didn't know how to approach directly, in the early morning hours before she woke, and in the late evenings after she'd gone to sleep. But he hadn't planned a sequence of words. He was going to have to find them as he went. "I left a lot of things," he said, "in my life. I was good at leaving. I told myself it was because I needed freedom, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I left things before they could stop working, because if they stopped working after I'd let myself need them." He stopped. Found the next part. "I didn't know what that would do to me, so I left first." She didn't say anything. She was listening the way she listened to things that mattered, fully, without preparing her response. "I'm not going to leave this," he said. "I want you to know that isn't something you need to wonder about. Not because I'm making you a promise about some future I can't see, but because I'm telling you what's true right now. Right now, there's nothing in me that wants to be anywhere that isn't here." The lamp flickered. He watched her face in the uneven light. "I know you're not asking me for that," he said. "You haven't asked me for anything. That's part of it, actually. The fact that you haven't asked." He looked at his hands on the table. "My wife asked, and I couldn't give her what she needed, and she was right to leave, and I understood it, but I also—" He stopped. "I also spent a long time after that deciding that the safest thing was to not be the kind of person who someone needed, because that particular failure was very expensive." "Rhett, I'm not finished," he said. Not harshly, just asking for the room to get through it. She settled. "You've needed things from me," he said. "The fence, the wood, someone to be there when those men came. And it hasn't felt like what I was afraid it would feel like. It's felt like the only thing I've done in 10 years that made sense." He looked at her. "I don't know what to do with that, except say it out loud." The silence that followed had weight to it, but not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that means something is settling into place. Mara looked at the lamp for a moment, then she looked at him, and her face had the open quality it got when she'd stopped managing what showed on it. "The morning after you came out from behind the barn," she said, "when those men left." She paused. "I stood in the yard after you came inside, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like, having someone on the same side of a problem as you are." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I'd forgotten that feeling. I think I'd decided I was done needing it." "And?" he said. "And I was wrong," she said. Simply, without drama. The same directness she brought to everything, including, apparently, this. "I was managing, I was surviving, the way you were surviving in the mountains. Getting out of bed for the chickens, keeping the numbers in the ledger, fixing what broke." She met his eyes. "But there's a difference. I know that now. You showed me that, although you probably didn't mean to." "What difference?" "Between keeping the place alive," she said, "and it actually being a home." He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the May evening was doing what May evenings do in high country, cooling fast as the sun dropped, the temperature falling 10 degrees in the hour after sundown, the sky going through its colors in the west. The tree line was dark against a horizon that was still orange at the edge. Somewhere out there, a whippoorwill was starting up its repetitive, earnest call. "There's something else," she said. He waited. She looked at her hands on the table, back at him. "I'm not an easy person to live with," she said. "I know that. I'm particular about how things are done, and I have opinions about things that probably don't merit strong opinions, and when something worries me, I get—" She searched for the word. "Focused," he said, a startled look. "I was going to say rigid. You get focused," he said. "It's different. Rigid is when you can't move. You move. You just move toward the problem." He paused. "I don't have a complaint about that." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been paying attention. You're worth paying attention to." She was quiet. He could see her taking that in, not deflecting it, not minimizing it, actually taking it in, which was something she was still learning to do, letting herself receive a thing without immediately converting it into something more practical. "You're not an easy person either," she said finally. "I want to say that clearly. You keep things too long before you say them. You'll tell yourself something is fine when it isn't, and I'll have to drag it out of you, and that is going to be a consistent problem." "Yeah," he said. "Probably. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I know. You're saying it because it's true.
Yes, she held his gaze. Because if we're doing this, whatever this is, then I need to be able to trust that you'll tell me when something is wrong, not protect me from it. Tell me. I know, he said. I remember. He paused. Don't go. She blinked.
That's what you told me I said, he said. In the fever, don't go. He looked at her steadily. I don't remember saying it, but I know I meant it. And I'm saying it now while I'm conscious, so there's no ambiguity about who I'm talking to. The whippoorwill called outside 3 times, then went quiet.
Mara's expression did something complicated. Not collapse. She wasn't a person who collapsed, but something long held in her face let go of its tension, the way a fence wire lets go when the post it's been straining against is finally set properly in solid ground. She put her hand on the table, not reaching for him, just placing it there. An offering, or an acknowledgement, or both. He put his hand over hers. They sat like that for a moment without speaking, with the lamp burning low between them and the evening cooling outside and the fields dark beyond the window, and it wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't the kind of moment that announces itself. It was quiet and slightly awkward and completely real, the way the things that actually matter tend to be. The lamp's almost out of oil, she said. I'll refill it. In the morning, she said. It's late. In the morning, he agreed. She stood up and moved around the table, and he stood too, and for a moment they were simply close in the small kitchen in the dimming lamplight, and she looked up at him with the straight, level look that he had come to understand was not distance, but its opposite. Her way of being fully present without the armor that full presence usually required. He put his hand against the side of her face. She leaned into it, very slightly, the way a person leans into warmth without meaning to. Then she stepped back and picked up the lamp to carry it to the bedroom, and he banked the stove for the night, and the cabin settled into its quiet. What happened next between them is theirs. The frontier has a long history of not requiring witnesses to the things that matter most, and this was no different. What can be said is that the next morning, when the light came in through the south-facing window and laid its long stripe across the floor, both of them were still there, and the morning after that, and the one after that. Summer came to the high country with a generosity that felt almost suspicious after the winter. Long days and good rain and the kind of heat that warmed the soil deep enough to make things grow with real conviction. The bean rows filled in. The corn came up straight. The potato hills swelled in a way that Rhett found genuinely satisfying every time he walked the rows, which he did more than was strictly necessary. Mara caught him at it once, just standing in the potato rows looking at the plants, and didn't say anything about it, which was its own kind of kindness. They're doing well, he said, a little defensively. They are, she agreed. No mockery in it, just the acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly the specific pleasure of watching something you planted come up right. They made the valley run together in June and sold 3 times what she'd sold alone in a single trip. The eggs, a surplus of early beans, 2 of the weaned kids from the goats. The money went into the ledger, and the ledger looked better than it had looked since Mara had started keeping it, and she showed him the page that evening with the same slightly surprised expression she'd had in May. Still all right, she said. Still all right, he confirmed. The argument about the winter wheat planting was resolved in August when the numbers came in and they discovered they'd both been partially right, which was the annoying kind of resolution, and also, he was finding, the most common kind. There were hard days. That needs saying because the alternative is a lie, and this is not that kind of story. There were days when the work was too much and the weather was wrong, and they were both tired in ways that made them short with each other. And the shortness would land wrong, and one of them would go quiet for a few hours, in the particular quality of silence that means something was said that shouldn't have been. There were days when she went into the bedroom and closed the door, and he understood that the room still had its history and always would, and he didn't knock. There were nights when he woke up in the dark from dreams he couldn't quite hold on to and lay in the quiet of the cabin and felt the old familiar pull, not toward the mountains exactly, but toward the abstract freedom of not being responsible for anything or anyone, the simpler geography of survival without attachment. He felt it, and he recognized it for what it was. Not a real desire, but an old habit, the shape his life had made in him over 14 years. And old habits don't disappear just because you've decided they're wrong. They just get quieter over time. On the worst of those nights, he would get up and go to the stove and make coffee, and sometimes she would hear him and come out, and they would sit at the table in the dark with their cups. And sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they wouldn't. And either way, the habit got a little quieter than it had been before. That's what he'd gotten wrong, all those years in the mountains. He'd thought that freedom meant the absence of ties. No obligation, no accountability, no one who needed anything from you. He'd carried that definition for so long that it had started to feel like truth. But a man with no ties is not free. A man with no ties is just untethered, and untethered things don't go anywhere in particular. They drift, and drifting has its own beauty. He wouldn't deny that. But beauty and purpose are not the same thing, and a person can starve on beauty alone just as surely as they can starve on an empty stomach. He'd proven that himself, in the mountains, in the specific way a man proves things that don't appear in any ledger. What tied you to the ground wasn't what imprisoned you. It was what gave you somewhere to stand. The first storm of the following winter came in October. He was splitting wood when the sky changed, the quality of the light going flat and yellowish, the way it went before serious weather. He felt it before he saw it, the way you learn to feel things in country that doesn't soften its announcements. He finished the piece he was splitting and drove the axe into the block and looked at the sky for a moment. He went to the barn. He moved through the pre-storm checklist the way he moved through it every time now, with the kind of practiced, unthinking competence that comes from repetition, from doing the same preparations enough times that they've passed through deliberate effort and become something more like instinct. Feed checked, water topped off. The barn door latch, the repaired one, holding fine through its second winter now, tested and secure. The horses settled and the goats complaining, as they always complained, about the change in air pressure or the smell of the coming snow, or just the general principle of the thing. Mara was already in the cabin when he came in. She had the stove going and the lamp lit and the water heating, and she was standing at the window watching the sky with the cup of coffee she'd poured at some point and not yet drunk. "How bad?" she said. "First of the season, probably 2 days." He hung his coat. "We're set." She nodded and looked back at the window. He came and stood beside her, and they looked at the sky together, the yellow going to gray at the edges, the first few flakes appearing out of the low clouds like scouts ahead of an army. The first winter they'd been in the same barn, in the same house, and then trying to survive what the cold could do. The infection, the fevers, the accumulated brutality of a season that had seemed personally committed to defeating them both. He remembered the first morning, the bowl on the table, already set. The question she'd asked him in the barn, "Have you eaten?" He hadn't understood what those words were the beginning of. Couldn't have. You never understand what the beginning of a thing is when you're standing inside it. "It's going to be a bad winter," she said. I can feel it." "We've handled bad winters," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Why, we've handled one bad winter. And we're better prepared for this one than we were for that one." She considered this. "The wood box is full," she said. "The wood box is full. The barn is stocked. The fence is solid. The root cellar is the best it's been since you started keeping this place." He paused. "And there are 2 of us." She looked back at the window. The snow was coming in earnest now, the flakes thicker, the visibility at the tree line beginning to soften. The approach road was disappearing under the white in the way approach roads did up here, quickly, with the particular efficiency of a season that knows how to close a place off from the world. She leaned slightly. Not dramatically, just slightly, in the way that bodies move toward warmth when warmth is present without the conscious mind calling the vote. He put his arm around her shoulders. She let the coffee cup rest against her chest and leaned the last inch and looked at the storm coming in over the fields they'd planted together, and the fence line they'd repaired together, and the approach road that led to a world that was, for the next 2 days at least, elsewhere. "I'm glad you found the barn," she said. He thought about that. About the fence post he'd nearly missed in the whiteout. About the calculation that had sent him to the barn rather than the cabin. About the goats that had hushed when he told them to, for no reason he'd ever been able to explain. About a bowl on a table, already set for a stranger. "I wasn't looking for anything," he said. "Just one more night." "I know." She paused. "That's usually how it goes. You stop looking and the thing finds you." He thought about that for a while. About the truth of it, and about all the things he'd been looking for over 14 years in the mountains, freedom or purpose,
or some version of himself that made sense on its own, and about how none of it had materialized when he was searching for it, and about a broken barn latch and a bowl of beans and a woman who didn't flinch. "Yeah," he said, "I think you're right." The storm settled in against the cabin. The wind picked up, and the eaves spoke in their familiar voice, and the snow came horizontal past the window, thick and serious. The real thing. Inside, the lamp burned on the table, and the stove pushed its warmth into every corner of the room, and the walls held against everything outside them. They stood at the window until the tree line disappeared entirely into white. Then she turned from the window and went to the stove to start supper, and he went to check the damper and put the extra wood by the hearth, and the ordinary machinery of their life together started up again. The particular, unremarkable, absolutely essential machinery of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and fit themselves to them, not perfectly, not without friction, but with the durable fit of things that have been tested and held. Outside, the frontier was doing what the frontier did. Everything at once, without apology, without pause. Inside, the woodbox was full, and neither of them faced the night alone.